Well, what the movie doesn't show, it really portrays Harry Truman in a very bad light. I'm always happy to have Harry Truman portrayed in a bad light. Uh, but it doesn't give any hint that Truman should never have been president. Franklin Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 1945 was Henry Wallace. Wallace was the second most popular man in America. On the day the Democratic Party convention met to choose the next president and vice president as a candidate, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll of potential voters asking them who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% of potential voters said they wanted Wallace back as vice president. 2% said they wanted Truman.
Mm-hmm.
But the party bosses controlled the convention and very undemocratically chose Truman because they knew he would go along with all their plans. And they knew that if Wallace was very radical, there would have been no French going back into Vietnam in 1945 if Wallace had been president, or if Roosevelt had been president, probably. There would have been no atomic bombings in 1945 if Wallace had been president, or if Roosevelt had lived longer. There would have been no Cold War, I think, had Wallace become president instead of Truman. So the fact that Truman is president throughout this period is, really a tragic mistake, and we're still paying the price for that. Then they show the 1954 Army the security clearance hearings, in which they strip Oppenheimer of his security clearance. So it criticizes McCarthyism. I think it's good that it does that, and it does that somewhat effectively. But as Oppenheimer's wife says, you let them tar and feather you in public because you think it'll somehow assuage your guilt about what you did in your life. And Einstein said that Oppenheimer was a fool to subject himself to that kind of public tarring and feathering, that kind of public excoriation, that kind of public vilification. So Oppenheimer, again, is in the movie is a very sympathetic character. He's a victim, but in reality, it's more complicated.
Mm-hmm. And do you think why there is a difference between the political atmosphere in the film and in reality? Uh, it is because of Nolan hadn't something in his mind.
Well, I mean, Nolan hated McCarthyism. He hates nuclear war. He hates nuclear weapons. I think he hates war. So I think that's great. But he very much made all the decisions about how to handle it. It's based on the book by American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin that won the Pulitzer Prize back in 2005. And if he really read Marty and Kai's work, he could have made a very different movie, especially about World War II. And once you do World War II, then the rest of it kind of flows. Back in 2020, for the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Marty Sherwin, Kai Bird, Gar Alperovitz, and I did a series of international press briefings and webinars, and we wrote an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times telling about the real history, about why the bombs were not needed, about the fact that the Soviet Union was the real target, that the Soviet invasion ended the war, not the atomic bombs. Nolan, there's no good excuse for him not having known that and included it. And he does have Oppenheimer later say in the movie that we bombed a defeated country, that they were already defeated. But in the movie, it supports the atomic bombings in 45. And so I don't know why Nolan did that.
Mm-hmm.
He did. I wish he had me as an advisor,
Mm-hmm.
and he would have had we could have avoided the mistakes. If he had had Kai Bird as an advisor, initially Marty Sherwin sadly passed away, but Kai Bird is young and active, and initially he would not let Kai read the script. Then when he let Kai read the script later, it was probably too late to change the things that were problems. And overall, Kai really likes it, the movie. Kai's seen it 5 times. It's a kind of movie you have to see more than once.
Mhm.
Because some of the dialogue is hard to pick up. So many characters. I mean, I've studied this period, so I know who all these people are, but I think it must be very confusing for people who maybe had a character introduced 2.5 hours earlier than the character reappears. So it's a complicated movie,
Mhm.
full of history. Most of the history is right, but I think some of it could have been done better. But overall, I think it's a great movie,
Okay.
despite that.
Uh,
And I'm glad, and it's triggering a lot of discussion in the United States.
mhm. And do you know the time that is the movie was began to be produced? Like how long?
Oh, they worked. Well, Christopher Nolan said he's been thinking about these issues since he was growing up in England in the 1980s. So he's always had this obsession about nuclear war.
Mhm.
And he actually brought it into some of his other movies. But I think they signed the contract with Marty and Kai the week that Marty passed away. I think that must have been 2021.
So
So,
very recently, huh?
yeah, it was not one of those. Whereas Marty's book, the book on the biography of Oppenheimer, which I have behind me on the shelf,
Mhm.
American Prometheus, Marty worked on that for like 20 years before he brought Kai in to help him finish the project. So it took 25 years to write. It's a big book. It's a great book, really wonderful book. Um, but the movie didn't take 25 years. The movie took about a year or two.
Yeah.
And Nolan wrote the script. And initially, he wouldn't let anybody see it. But finally, Kai got to read it, and he got to go to the set. And the acting is terrific. One thing I should mention is that most movies, there have been very few movies that deal with the bomb, but most of them make Leslie Groves to be the villain, the bad guy. The As Leslie Groves, as Fiston said, he was the biggest son of a bitch I ever met. I hated his guts, and so did everyone else. But in the movie, Leslie Groves is played by Matt Damon, and it's the warmest and fuzziest version of Leslie Groves you're ever going to see. So Leslie Groves is a good guy in the movie, not the real Leslie Groves who was a son of a bitch. Uh, so, but the movie makes Louis Strauss out to be the bad guy, and Louis Strauss is really the one who went after Oppenheimer, who persecuted him in the 1950s, who took away his security clearance, and then gets punished himself. They show the 1959 hearing in which Louis Strauss does not get, the Senate rejects his nomination to be in the cabinet as Secretary of Commerce. The first time that a cabinet member was rejected by the Senate since 1925. And that's largely because of his role in destroying Oppenheimer.